We don't start till 3:30, right?
No, we start at 3. Start at 3.
We start.
Yeah, we start at 3. Let's see. Yeah. Everyone will be here very early.
How can I say hi to you? Can I just
We
say
can hear
hi?
you, yeah.
Can you hear me, John?
Yeah, hello, hi.
Can you
I can
see
hear
me?
you.
Yeah?
Yeah, I can see. I mean, you're not particularly big on my screen, but yes, I can see you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
okay.
Oh, up there. Okay, hi. I'm Ellen Carlson. I'm the one that's sending you all that information.
Okay,
So
all right, thanks.
Yes,
Yeah.
thank you for doing this for the center.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah.
All looking forward to it.
Yes. Okay, well, let me just remove the transcript here so we can get this a little bigger. Okay. All right, well, welcome everyone. Thank you for coming. My name's Ann Botso. I help direct the Center for Applied Ethics. We do all sorts of programming. If you're not familiar with what we do, one of the programming initiatives we do is to invite speakers. And so we're really excited to have John here. And John will be speaking about the ethics of personalized digital duplicates, a principled framework. So Dr. Danaher is lecturer in law at the University of Galway. His research focuses on the ethical, legal, and social implications of new technologies. He maintains a blog called Philosophical Disquisitions and produces a podcast with the same title. He also writes for the Institute for Ethics and Emerging Technologies. He has published over 50 papers on a wide range of issues, including the risks of advanced AI and the ethics of social robotics, and has produced a number of books, including Automation and Utopia, Human Flourishing in an Age Without Work, and A Citizen's Guide to Artificial Intelligence. Dr. Danaher, thanks so much for being with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot as well for inviting me to give this talk. And yeah, I also appreciate you changing the time slot of it to accommodate my personal schedule. So that's great. It's also, when people read out my bio, I'm always reminded of the fact that I should probably update my bio on my webpage. So not that anything that you said was incorrect, but I just realized it's a few years out of date. But yeah, thanks for that. So what I'm going to talk about today is an ethical framework for thinking about the phenomenon of digital duplicates. And at the outset, I should say that this is a topic that I'm working on with a colleague of mine who's named on the screen there, Sven Nieholm, who's based at the Ludwig Maximilians University of Munich, where he is the professor for the ethics of AI. So we're currently drafting a couple of papers on this topic, and this is one of them. So I'll do 3 main things in this talk. One is I will, first of all, clarify the phenomenon that I'm interested in, the technology that I'm interested in, namely technology that facilitates the creation of digital duplicates. I'll give a few examples and a definition of what I'm talking about. Second, I will give a list or description of the generic harms and benefits associated with this technology. I'm pitching that at a fairly abstract level, not looking at specific use cases of the technology, although I will use some specific examples as I go along. And then finally, I will introduce a principle, something that myself and Sven call a minimally viable principle for thinking about the ethical deployment of this technology. And that principle has a number of conditions, and that we're interested in figuring out whether those conditions can be met in practice. So let me start with the first of those topics, which is the technology itself. What exactly am I talking about? So let me see if I can advance these slides now. I'm sure you're all big fans of ABBA here, no doubt. Fairly universally popular band, Swedish, of course, from the 1970s and 80s. I think they disbanded officially in 1984, 82, something like that. In recent times, they have reunited and recorded new material, but they have also been pioneers in the creation of holographic doubles. So the image on screen here are not the real ABBA. These are the holographic versions of ABBA that currently perform live shows in London in a specially built arena, the ABBA Voyage Arena, where they give shows that have been described by The Guardian as was it groundbreaking and awe-inspiring. So that you can see the youthful version of ABBA on stage every night if you like. So that's an example of the technology that myself and Sven are interested in this paper. People creating duplications or replications of real people, actual people, in some virtual or digital form. Here's another example, which is a slightly more analog or material example. The image on screen here is of the Japanese roboticist Hiroshi Ishiguro alongside his robotic double. So Ishiguro is a pioneer in animatronic robots. He creates very lifelike robotic models, including duplications of real people and most notably of himself. I don't know if anyone's ever heard Ishiguro give a talk or speak. I saw him speak a number of years ago at a conference in Europe called the Robo Philosophy Conference, where he joked that sometimes if the conference organizers didn't agree to pay him a sufficient fee, he would send the robotic double instead of himself to give the talk. So last year or 2 years ago, I guess now, Ishiguro gave a talk at the Robo Philosophy Conference where he outlined his vision for the future, which is actually funded as well by the Japanese government as one of their moonshot projects for the future, which he aims to realize a society in which everyone can freely participate in various social activities, work, education, medical care, and daily life, among others, through the teleoperation of multiple avatars that can fully transmit the user's actions and intentions. And so what he seems to mean by this is everyone will have access to robotic doubles like the version of himself that he has created. And we can use this to kind of enhance our engagement with the world. Literally speaking, what he says in his paper, and this is what his project is funded for, is that he wants to help us to overcome the limitations of space and time in our daily lives. Because there's only one of us to go around, and he can kind of overcome that natural limitation of just one body, one mind per person, in a sense. So that's another example of technology that we're interested in. These are quite high-tech versions of the phenomenon that we're interested in, not accessible to most people. Bringing it back down to earth a little bit, to technology that is actually readily accessible to most people right now, is generative AI, which has obviously attracted a lot of media attention in the past couple of years, and debate as well amongst academics. A chatbot generative AI like ChatGPT or variations on it like Claude or Gemini, it is possible through the fine-tuning of those models to create duplicate chatbots of real people. And this has already happened to greater or lesser extents. Some of the examples have been pretty controversial. Early on, after the introduction of ChatGPT in November 2022, there was a German magazine that attracted a degree of controversy for creating a chatbot version of Michael Schumacher, a well-known Formula One driver who has been in a state of impaired consciousness for the best part of a decade. And they conducted an interview with the chatbot version of Michael Schumacher that was published. The editor was subsequently fired for permitting this. Another example, the economist Tyler Cowen from, I can't recall the university he's from. Is it George Mason University? He runs a well-known blog called The Marginal Revolution. And he has a podcast associated with that blog where he last year conducted an interview with a ChatGPT model of the Irish author Jonathan Swift, who's best known, of course, for the book Gulliver's Travels. In a more philosophical vein, the well-known philosopher Daniel Dennett has had a chatbot model of himself created called DigiDan. This was created by Anna Strasser and Eric Schwitzgebel and I'm guessing his brother or some relative of his, whose name I forget, so I apologize for that. But they created this version of Dan Dennett, and they wrote a paper about the creation of this model, which they did with Dan Dennett's consent, I should add, where they got it to basically give answers to philosophical questions, and they sent off the answers to experts in the work of Daniel Dennett, and they found that the experts weren't always very good at telling the difference between the real version of Daniel Dennett and the digital version of Daniel Dennett. Another example here, moving away from the academic sphere to the world of social media, Karen Marjorie, who's a Snapchat influencer, last year created something called Karen AI, which is a GPT model trained on her social media outputs that can enable a virtual girlfriend experience for her many followers. You can go to, I think it's Karen.ai is the name of the website, and you can sign up to create an account where you can interact with her on an ongoing basis. And she's not the only social media influencer to have tried to create a digital chatbot model of themselves. I could go on with many more illustrations or examples of it, but I think that suffices to give you a sense of what I'm interested in here. And as I say, you're moving here from highly sophisticated technologies like the ABBA holograms or the Ishiguro robot into technologies that are still very sophisticated but are actually readily accessible to people, such as these chatbot AI models. And all of them are examples of what I would call digital duplicates, which I would define as a partial, at least somewhat autonomous replica or recreation of a real person in a digital form. Okay, I mean, by the way, sorry, partial in the sense that none of these duplicates are full or complete replications of real people. It may not even be metaphysically possible to create a replication of a real person. I won't get into that debate right now, but none of the models that exist today could function as an equivalent of an actual person in all environments or all contexts. They tend to only fulfill or recreate a partial aspect of a person. All of these models as well, I should say, are at least somewhat autonomous in the sense that they can generate outputs or interactions without the direct control or input of a human. So the chatbots can generate responses. The Karen AI can generate responses on behalf of Karen Marjorie without her direct oversight or approval of those responses. There's a variety of examples of these duplicates in existence nowadays. The kind that are probably accessible to most people now are these, what I'm calling cognitive duplicates, that sit in for people in replicating their cognitive style, their style of interaction or conversation, their style of thinking. There are these visual and auditory duplicates like the ABBA holograms that are really intended to recreate the visual and auditory experience of a real person. Most of these duplicates are what I call function specific. They are intended to do one very specific kind of thing. Some of them have a slightly broader set of functions. I just want to kind of issue a couple of caveats about the definition that I'm offering on screen here, questions that people might have about it. There are other terms in the literature that you might think we ought to use to describe this technology, given that they're already used by some people and maybe they are descriptive. So one example of a technology of a term that is widely used is that of the avatar. And you might link that, to, of course, to the movie of the same name, in which that phenomenon is represented as well. But avatar is the term, for example, used by Ishiguro in his presentation on the future of digital doubles. There's a reason why I don't like the term avatar in this context, which is that I think the term avatar is over-inclusive. An avatar can be any sort of digital representation that is intended to stand in for a real person without necessarily replicating or recreating actual features of a real person. So, for example, if you play video games, you might play that video game through an avatar, but the avatar in no sense is intended to be you or be anything like you, right? And in some cases, you might want the avatar to be as different from you as possible. I'm really just interested in replications or representations of people that are intended to actually be like them in some sense. So that's one reason for avoiding the term avatar. There is also the terminology of a digital twin, which is, of course, much closer to what we're talking about in this paper, which you might think is more appropriate, and that is used in certain academic fields at the moment. But I think that that term is actually slightly under-inclusive in a specific sense, which is that digital twins have tended to take on a particular meaning in biomedical science and also biomedical ethics. That a digital twin is a representation of a person that's usually used for some kind of diagnostic medical purpose. So I want to avoid using that term because what I'm interested in and what myself and Sven are interested in is a slightly broader concept of a digital twin or a duplicate. But you could think of digital twins as being a subtype of digital duplicate. And finally, then, you might wonder why or what distinguishes digital duplicates from novel artificial beings, so wholly new artificial entities that aren't even intended to replicate or recreate a real person, and that are autonomous as well in some way. And I mean, the main reason for not including them within the scope of this discussion and focusing specifically on digital duplicates is I think that digital duplicates raise some interesting ethical and specifically axiological questions. So questions of value. So there's distinct kinds of value that can be realized through the creation of digital duplicates, and also distinct kinds of harm, I think, that can be realized through the use of digital duplicates that separates them out from the broader class of artificial beings. So that's why we decide to zone in on this particular phenomenon in this paper. Okay, so that's the first part of the paper. It's kind of just definitional scene setting stuff. Moving more into the ethical content of it. One of the things that myself and Sven are interested in is the harms and benefits of digital duplicates. And there are a number of inquiries into this phenomenon that are specific to certain fields. So just to give two illustrations, there is already a kind of ethical debate about the creation of grief bots. So these are chat bots that recreate real people that have died, that their loved ones or people that were close to them use after they have died to kind of sustain a connection with them. And they're a very interesting phenomenon and worthy of discussion. But we're not focusing specifically on grief bots here, so we're not looking at specific harms that arise from people who would use a digital duplicate in that sort of bereavement type setting. Another example, a friend of mine, or an academic friend of mine in a way, a guy called Brian Earp, has created a chatbot version of himself as an academic writing partner. And he's written about this in a paper called AutoGen, which appeared in the American Journal of Bioethics last year. Excuse me. And so he discusses some of the harms and benefits associated with duplicating himself as an academic writing assistant. And that's an interesting inquiry, but again, it's specifically focused on the impact of that technology in that domain or that field. So what myself and Sven are trying to do in this particular paper is to discuss harms and benefits at a slightly more abstract level and more generic level. Kind of harms and benefits that could arise in almost any context in which you would use this technology. So I'm just going to go through a list of them and I'll give some examples as I go along. So first of all, like, what are the potential benefits of this technology? Well, one obvious benefit of the technology is that it enables a wider distribution of an otherwise scarce relationship or style of interaction. So if you think about Karen Marjorie, the Snapchat influencer who created the AI chatbot of herself, she as an individual is scarce in some sense. She can only interact with so many people in a given day. There's only one of her to go around. She can't have a personalized interaction with all of her followers. By creating the chatbot version of herself, she can enable a wider distribution of her otherwise scarce relationship or style of interaction. That would be an example of this. The second benefit is the continuation of a personally unique service. So there's already some discussion of this in educational and medical contexts. So a professional colleague of mine, who I won't mention directly here, has expressed some interest in creating a chatbot version of themselves to interact with their students. On the grounds that, again, they can't have office hours with all their students, and they can't be accessible to all of their students 24/7. So that their service as an educator is limited in various ways. Using a chatbot version of themselves, it would enable the continuation of that service, kind of against beyond their sort of personal limitations in some way. Similar examples in a medical context is people have discussed the creation of therapy bots, and again, not generic novel therapy bots, but therapy bots that are designed to replicate or recreate an actual therapist or a real therapist. Sorry, I'm kind of getting choked up a small bit here. Would you mind if I just take a very small break to get a drink of water?
Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, sorry about that.
No worries.
How long did that take?
Yeah, sorry about that.
Oh, no problem.
That's never happened to me before, but there you go.
Happens to the best of us.
All right, so yeah, continuation of a personally unique service. I think I probably covered that example enough. These are all, by the way, somewhat similar in that they're all linked to overcoming what Ishiguro spoke about in his presentation of the limitations of space and time. So the technology allows you to overcome limitations of space and time. So they all sort of fit within that field. The preservation of a unique identity or set of attributes after death or incapacity. So again, the kind of grief bots that I mentioned previously, where people try to preserve somebody's interactive style or their attributes in a chatbot after they've passed on, would be an illustration of this. I can also imagine, by the way, some authors who are maybe terminally ill, right, who want to finish a project, like a book project, could in principle create an AI version of themselves to finish the project after they die. And I have an example of that in the paper that one of the papers that I wrote with Sven, of a real author who I won't mention now, but you can ask me about it later on. I think it's a reasonably good illustration because I've done some actual experiments on their particular style of writing to see if it would be possible, and it seems like it would. Again, enhanced productivity of an individual. This is probably an obvious one. Again, to go back to the example of Brian Earp with his academic writing version of himself, so trained on his own writings, fine-tuned on his own writings to replicate his authorial style. He highlights, the enhanced productivity as an advantage here, that he could write more papers as a result of using this technology. And this is probably the most widely discussed benefit of this particular technology in the literature. Some of it is not focused specifically on digital duplicates. It's focused on the productivity benefits of generative AI more generally, but this is an example of a benefit as well. The technology could enable genuine multitasking without bandwidth limitations. A lot of people think that they can multitask. cognitive psychologists would tell you that it's relatively impossible or relatively difficult to do that in any kind of meaningful sense. Everyone's subject to some kind of bandwidth limitations. Maybe the technology enables you to engage in some genuine multitasking without those limitations. The technology enables a pleasurable substitution or desirable substitution in task performance and interaction. There are many things that you don't want to do on an ongoing basis. You can create a digital duplicate of yourself to perform those tasks in your stead. Again, to go back to the example that Ishiguro gave of, sending the robotic double to give the talk on his behalf, well, you can see benefits on that. That he doesn't have to travel around the world to deliver the talk. Think also maybe of the members of ABBA with their holographic doubles. They're, getting on in years. They probably aren't as sprightly and able to jump around the stage as energetically as they once were. Maybe they can't even sing as well as they once could. They can send the holographic doubles in their stead, and they could sit at home in Sweden and rake in the money without having to, work up a sweat. Enhanced decision-making or proxy decision-making. This is actually a really interesting example because there's some active research projects on this. So I think the name is Jana Shack-Borg and Walter Sinnott Armstrong. They have a project that's funded by the Templeton Foundation on creating ideal observers that are replicating real people. So the specific example they have is like a doctor who wants to make a decision in a medical context, but is somehow impaired. Maybe they're tired, stressed, they've just been woken up or something in the middle of the night and asked to make a decision or a contribution on something. Well, why not create an AI version of them that is trained on their specific clinical judgments that can act as an ideal observer or assistant to them in making decisions in this kind of stressful context. And they're actually really creating this technology as we speak and trialing it. That's an example of a benefit as well. In terms of harms, these are maybe the things that are more interesting from an ethical perspective, because the question is whether these harms are sufficiently weighty to mitigate against using the technology. An obvious one is the exploitation and alienation of people from their attributes and identities. So what I mean here is that who you are, your attributes, your features can now be extracted from you, replicated in a digital form, and perpetuated. This is obviously a major source of concern, by the way, in recent Hollywood strikes. Actors concerned about the creation of AI versions of them that can act indefinitely. So, it's already happened famously to some actors. The earliest example that I can think of would have been, Carrie Fisher from Star Wars. They created a computer-generated version of her to act in one of the movies after she had died. You can imagine the same thing happening all the time. By the way, you can imagine this happening in an academic context, and there are already some canaries in the coal mine, so to speak, of this, where universities have taken course materials prepared by people and used them to educate people online after they've died. So there's been some controversy about this in the UK and in Canada in recent times. Beyond that kind of commercial or exploitation within an employment context, you can imagine the technology being used for various forms of identity theft and fraud, and using somebody else's identity for gain in a broader context. Identity theft is a major problem nowadays, and it's likely to become an even bigger problem with the advent of this technology. I think it's tens of millions of incidents in the US alone every year. I have the statistic in the paper that I wrote with Sven. So you can imagine that also being a problem with this technology. The danger that the technology is a poor or faulty representation of an individual. I mean, this is a hypothetical example, although not incredibly divorced from reality, or at least in terms of what's possible with the technology. But if you imagine the digital version of the philosopher Daniel Dennett, what if you started asking it questions about Dennett's views on race or homosexuality or something like this, and started spitting back various prejudicial answers? I'm sure they don't reflect Dan Dennett's actual views, but they could create this misimpression of what his actual views are, given that people think that the chatbot is otherwise a reasonable representation of his philosophical views. There's a danger, perhaps, if you're relying upon a chatbot or an AI digital double, that you become excessively dependent upon it. It leads to kind of atrophy. It becomes counterproductive. You wanted to use the technology to become more productive and more available, but you now rely on it too much, and this undermines your productivity in some way. There's obviously a danger that the technology is used for various forms of deception and manipulation, because the technology appears like a person or acts like a person, and we get misled by it. I'll come back to that later on, because that becomes a major feature in one of the leading objections to the technology that I'll discuss. There's a danger that the technology pushes society towards a low trust equilibrium. If we become suspicious about who we're interacting with, we're not sure if we're interacting with the real version of you or the duplicated version of you. Maybe we'll just become less trusting as a society. I should add that there's some preliminary experimental evidence to suggest that technology like ChatGPT could have this effect in cooperative games. So just in an experimental setting, if you know that the person that you're interacting with might be using ChatGPT, there is a likelihood that you'd be less trusting of them. There's some evidence to suggest that that's true already. I can talk about that in more detail if you want later on. There's a danger of responsibility gaps. These are widely discussed in the debate about automation. The idea here is, if the digital duplicate does something wrong, if it does express, let's say, racist views, or if it does, I can admit that person, sorry. If it does defame somebody or harm somebody in some way, who's responsible for that? Are you, as the original person, responsible for it? Is it the person who owns and controls the technology? These are well-worn debates in the ethics of AI, but they apply specifically to digital duplicates as well. And there's also this, what I call the credit blame asymmetry. It's another paper that I've written with Sven and some other people on this topic, that we're more likely to be blamed for the faulty outputs of a generative AI double than we are to be credited with the positive outputs of it, for various reasons. So there's a kind of unique asymmetry in how we assign credit and blame that creates a particular harm with this technology. And then this is a more speculative and general harm, but a lot of kind of Western civilizations in particular are based on an ethics of individuality or individualism, that the individual human is the most valuable and important thing. And if it's possible for individuals to become replicated or duplicated, maybe there is a degradation in the value of the individual because we all become non-unique in some sense. And this could lead to as kind of undermining the moral paradigm of our societies in some way. That, as I say, is a more speculative harm, but might be something worth considering. And it is something that some people have expressed concerns about as well. Okay. So that is those are the kind of generic harms and benefits associated with the technology. Moving more into the sort of principled application of the technology. When can it be used and in what contexts? The first thing I just want to talk about is, what are the different scenarios of deployment that we should be interested in? And I'm just going to go through these like really quickly, but here are like, I think it's 5 scenarios that I think are in which people might use a digital duplicate. Here's the first scenario, which I would call a purely private use of a digital duplicate, where you have an original person creates a duplicate of themselves to interact with, perhaps, almost as an experimental plaything or a toy. And they don't use the digital duplicate to alter or change their interactions with any third parties. It's just as I say, a purely private endeavor. A second scenario is where they create a digital duplicate of themselves and they use that digital duplicate in the background, in the back end, if you like, to change how they interact with third parties. So, I mean, the writing assistant is an illustration of this. You use that to maybe generate draft papers, but then you sort of take ownership over the final product that you then publish and share with the rest of the world. Then you can flip that around. A different scenario is where you create the digital duplicate and you use the duplicate to interact with the third parties. So the Karen AI, where she creates the AI version of herself to interact with her followers, would be an illustration of that. Okay, she's in the background, it's the duplicate that does the interacting with other people. Finally, sort of more complicated scenario, because most of those assume that it's the person being duplicated that controls or makes the decision to create the duplicate in the first place. But of course, that mightn't be true. It might be an employer, it might be a third party who makes that decision. And so we can imagine variations on that scenario involving the interactions with the third party. So maybe you have a purely private scenario with a third party. So I create a GPT version of myself to interact with as an experimental plaything. But of course, I don't actually own and control the software. It's owned and controlled by OpenAI, so they're always kind of lurking in the background of that interaction. I could also imagine a situation in which a third party creates a duplicate of me to interact with other people. So again, the Hollywood studio creating an AI version of an actor that they then put in their movies to present to the outside world. Yeah, the scenario here. And by the way, just a final point here is you might say that in all contexts, there's in fact a shadow third party present, because with very few exceptions, most people do not have the capacity to create these technologies entirely by themselves. They're always relying on third party platforms or third party technologies. So you could say that there's always a shadow third party in the background in all the cases discussed to this point. Right, so finally then moving on to, is it permissible to create digital duplicates, and in what context might it be permissible to do so? So look, it's hard to discuss this in the abstract outside of specific contexts, but I'm nevertheless going to try to do so. And so one of the things that we do in the paper is that we invent or come up with something that we call the minimally viable permissibility principle for the deployment of digital duplicates. So just in the philosophical background here, we view this as kind of like a mid-level normative principle. So what that means is that it is not specifically reliant on any particular theory, a normative theory like a deontological theory or a utilitarian theory or a virtue ethics theory, something like that. It is rather a principle that could be derived from each of those theories, and we think would be satisfactory to these different theoretical viewpoints. And so what we mean by minimally viable in this context is a term we borrow from product development in software. It's a principle that is likely to be agreeable to most people in most contexts. Okay, and it sets a sufficiently high bar on the permissibility of the use of the technology that skeptics or critics of the technology are going to be satisfied if the conditions are satisfied, and promoters of the technology are also going to be satisfied because the technology can at least be deployed in certain contexts. That's the idea behind it. Okay. And you might say, why is it interesting to come up with a minimally viable permissibility principle? Well, one reason, which I'll get back to in a moment, is that some people think that this technology is absolutely abhorrent and should never be created or deployed in any context, and we should do everything we can to try and stop it. And so if you can show that the conditions within the minimally viable principle are met, that could overcome that sort of extreme skepticism of the technology. So in the paper that I wrote, Sven, we go through each condition in this principle in some detail and see whether it can be met in practice, and then reach a verdict essentially on whether you can deploy the technology or not. I am not going to go through every condition in this principle in detail in this talk because it would take far too long. What I will do is I will discuss some conditions and leave you with some sort of critical thoughts about it as well. So the principle, as it is on screen here, it identifies 4 conditions that have to be met in order for the technology to be deployed in a permissible form. Number 1 is that there must be informed consent to the creation of the duplicate. Number 2 is that there must be at least some minimal positive value realized by its creation. Number 3 is that there must be transparency in any interactions with the duplicate. We mean here transparency primarily with third parties interactions. And finally, there must be some appropriate harm or risk mitigation strategy for the deployment of the technology. There is actually a 5th condition in the paper, but I'm not going to include it in this discussion because it's a slightly obscure condition. But if you're burning with interest at the end and you really want to know what it is, I can tell you what it is. Right. So as I say, I'm not going to discuss each of these conditions, but I'll just focus on a couple of them. So if you take the first one there, the informed consent condition, that should be relatively uncontroversial. Informed consent is a requirement in many contexts already, medical contexts being the most obvious illustration. So there are well-established informed consent provisions out there that could be easily sort of copied to the deployment of this technology. What we say in the paper is that there are these 4 kind of requirements here in order to establish informed consent. Number 1 is the basic thing that you must know that you are being duplicated. You must know by whom you are being duplicated, if not by yourself. You must know for what purpose you're being duplicated. And you must also know, this consent must also be an ongoing requirement. So you are entitled to withdraw your consent at any point in time. And if there's any sort of change in the purpose or use of the technology, you should be informed of that, and your consent should be sought again. Again, none of these things is particularly novel or original to this technology. These are well-established ideas in the literature on informed consent, but we think that they should be applied to this technology as well. So that's the kind of basic idea behind informed consent. Skipping the second condition, if you look at the third condition, transparency in interactions, why is that important? Well, I mean, it might seem kind of intuitively obvious that transparency is valuable when it comes to the use of a technology like this. Some obvious reasons as to why transparency is valuable. Transparency can help mitigate, to some extent, risks of manipulation and overdependence on the technology. So it could be part of a kind of a harm risk mitigation strategy. It's also maybe a basic idea that people just have a right to know who they are interacting with. If they're not interacting with a real person, they have a right to know that. A lot of philosophers would be concerned that if you're interacting with a double, a duplicate, and you're not aware of that, then the relationship or interaction that you're having with that double has less value than it would if you were interacting with a real person, and that could be deemed to be a problem. So the notion that people have a right to know in this context seems straightforward enough. I should also add, by the way, that this has become, in effect, a legal requirement. In the EU AI Act, which some of you might have heard of, Article 52 of the EU AI Act stipulates that people essentially have a right to know if they're not interacting with a natural person. So they need to be informed of that. Philosophers might be interested in whether you also need to have some condition of self-transparency. And again, it might seem trivial because if I create a chatbot version of myself to interact with students in my classes, presumably I know what I'm doing and I know that, I'm interacting with the chatbot or something like this, or there's no kind of loss of transparency there. But you could actually maybe imagine contexts in which it isn't transparent to you that you have created a duplicate version of yourself. So there may be 2 scenarios here that might be worth discussing. One would be people with certain advanced states of cognitive decline or impairment. Maybe they don't realize the distinction between themselves and their duplicate. So maybe that's a concern we should have. And also then more speculative philosophical ideas that maybe some people become so sort of dependent and interactive with the duplicated version of themselves that they lose the sense of a distinction between themselves and the duplicate. They view themselves as one coherent or single entity or one extended mind or identity. And that seems like an interesting possibility. And we discussed that in the paper, and maybe there is a need for self-transparency in those contexts too, that you're aware. So if there's a concern about cognitive impairment and a lack of self-transparency, that will be a reason not to use the technology. And if there's a risk of losing yourself in the technology, that should be kind of made apparent to people as well. Yeah, sorry. I just realized I skipped a slide here. Last thing, appropriate harm and risk mitigation. Okay, so this is the challenging condition, and this is the one that's most difficult to meet in practice, I think, because you have a number of questions here, which is like, what is appropriate harm or risk mitigation? You can't eliminate all risks. You can't reduce risk to zero. So what would be an appropriate level of risk mitigation? That's a challenge. Upon whom does the burden of risk mitigation fall? That's a challenge, figuring out who that is. Again, is it the person creating a duplicate? Is it the person who is duplicated? Is it the person who controls the technology that enables the duplication? Is it maybe some other third party, like a government organization, who is best placed to pay the costs or address the problems? So those are significant practical challenges when it comes to the technology itself. And I should also add that it's here that we encounter, possibly the main opposition to the technology as well, that there are some people out there who think that it is impossible to mitigate the risks associated with this technology, so much so that we should ban the technology itself. And the main example of this that I have come across is, in fact, Danaher, who I mentioned earlier in the paper, who ironically is a person who has been duplicated, right? So Anna Strasser, as I mentioned, she created this chatbot version of Daniel Dennett to generate Dennett-like responses to philosophical inquiries. And Dennett reflects upon this, by the way, in his recent autobiography or memoir, which said, his reflections suggest that maybe he wasn't entirely happy with the project, even though he consented to it and went along with it. He's a little bit wary of the results of it. And so he wrote an op-ed last year in The Atlantic, where he decried the creation of counterfeit people. And he said that they are the most dangerous artifacts in human history, capable of destroying not just economies, but human freedom itself. And before it is too late, we must outlaw both the creation of counterfeit people and the passing along of counterfeit people. He goes on to identify the risks associated with this. Our natural inclination to treat anything that seems to talk sensibly with us as a person will turn us into sitting ducks. The cost to human trust will be enormous. How will you respond to having your friends and family probe you with gotcha questions every time you interact with them? Democracy depends on the informed consent of the governed. By allowing the most economically and politically powerful people, corporations, and governments to control our attention, these systems, he means counterfeit people, will control us. So these are all kind of strong terms here. I have more here on the slides identifying it. So it's an interesting op-ed, attracted a reasonable degree of commentary when it was released. Very hard to work out exactly what his argument is in this op-ed, and maybe it's unfair to do this as well because op-eds are short and they're not necessarily rigorously defended or argued. So I acknowledge that, but trying to work out, what's his actual concern? Why does he think it's such a dangerous technology? There's a couple of ways of reconstructing it. This is one way of doing it. He seems to be suggesting that if something poses a significant threat to democracy, because he talks about the value of democracy and informed consent being relevant to democracy, then that thing should be outlawed. The creation and use of counterfeit people poses a significant threat to democracy, therefore it should be outlawed. Maybe he's also concerned about human freedoms. You could substitute human freedom for democracy in that argument to reach a very sort of similar conclusion. The critical thing, of course, is setting aside the first premise of this, whether that's true, whether we should outlaw something if it poses a significant threat to democracy or human freedom. Is it true that the creation and use of this technology will pose such a significant threat? He identifies various grounds for that: undermining informed consent, resilience to manipulation, undermining our capacity for agency, the centralization and localization of power amongst those that can control the technology itself. These are all reasons to think that it will pose such a significant threat. And I think that, those are all legitimate concerns about the technology itself. Let me just close on a sort of counter-argument or counterpoint to Dennett, and then I'm happy to take any comments or questions you have. So this isn't entirely original to me, and this is something that other people commenting on Dennett's article have raised. I'm going to forget the name of the person who originally came up with this, but I can look it up in a minute. Dennett makes a lot of use of the counterfeit analogy in the paper, counterfeit people being a concern. And as some people pointed out, historically, counterfeit currency comes in different types, okay? And you can think about two distinct forms of counterfeit currency. And I should say at the outset that this is an argument that may appeal more to people with a background in monetary theory or the history of money. I used to once upon a time teach a course on banking law and monetary theory, so this sort of appeals to me, and maybe it'll appeal less to you, but I'll go through it nonetheless. So one type of counterfeit currency is what we might call debased coinage. So what you mean by that is a coined currency that has less value than its face value. So you substitute a lesser valued metal for silver or gold in a currency, or you cut off or remove some of the metal in the coin as a way of reducing its value. And this is actually a practice. This is something that was commonly done by sovereigns, kings and queens, historically, to reduce their kind of debts and increase their wealth relative to other people in society. They would debase coinage. And debased coinage creates problems in society because it undermines trust in the currency system. And so Dennett's argument could be that counterfeit people are kind of like debased personhood. They undermine trust in society because they have less value than real human beings. That could be his argument. There is an alternative type of counterfeit currency, which we could just call alternative coinage, which is not so much that it's debased in its face value, but rather that it's coinage that comes from the wrong source. Okay, it is not something that is under the control of a government or the legitimate sovereign. And so there's lots of history of alternative currencies. And we're kind of living through an era as well in which there was an attempt to create an alternative coinage or alternative currency system through technology. I'm thinking here of cryptocurrency, which you could view as an alternative coinage because it's not something controlled by central banks. And that alternative coinage doesn't necessarily create problems for trust in society. What it actually creates is problems for the authority or power of a sovereign. It reduces their power because they no longer control the currency system. So an alternative way of looking at the creation of counterfeit people, which might lessen Dennett's concerns, is that it's not so much that they are debased people, but they are people that might be created by the wrong source. They might undermine a source of power. So here's a hypothesis to conclude on. Perhaps some digital duplicates or counterfeit people are harmful not because they undermine social trust and confidence, but because they are perceived as harmful because they take power away from people who are already powerful. And here I'm going to identify people like you and me as one of the people who are sets of people that are most threatened by this technology. We are, in some sense, part of a cognitive elite. If you're working in a third-level institution or you're an academic or researcher, then this is true of you, I would say. You are someone who has attained a status in society through your cognitive power, your cognitive abilities. And one potential danger of this technology, one reason why it's perceived as harmful from your perspective, is that it takes away that competitive advantage. And there is some experimental evidence to suggest that this may be one of the main effects of the technology. Here are 3 papers that illustrate this effect. There have actually been more since I prepared these slides. So there's about half a dozen papers on this topic now. Basically, what all these papers have found is that when you get a technology like GPT deployed in a kind of problem-solving, cognitive-based form of work, the chief advantage of the technology tends to flow to the lesser skilled workers, the people with less education or less time on job. And the technology tends to be less beneficial to the already elite workers. And there are measurable gains in influence for or power or ability for the lesser skilled workers. So there's some evidence here to suggest that one of the things that generative AI type technologies do is that they reduce the competitive advantage of a cognitive elite. And maybe that's one reason why people are so concerned about it. Not so much that they undermine trust in society, but that they undermine the power of people who would rather not have their power threatened. Now, I'm be the first to admit that this is a very speculative argument, and there are many legitimate criticisms of it. One obvious criticism of it is that, again, who owns and controls the means of the production of duplicated people. In most instances, it's not the people themselves, it is large technology corporations. So that is a very legitimate concern about this type of argument. But I'm just kind of throwing it out there at the end as an alternative perspective to Sir Dennett's pessimism about duplicate people. All right, I'm going to leave it at that. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions you might have.
Great, thanks, John. Appreciate it. We've got about 15 minutes for questions, and if anybody online wants to throw a question in the chat, I can try to keep on top of that as well. So any questions for John? Yes.
Earlier in your talk, you mentioned that there was some kind of experiment done with gamers about if they believe that there's an AI, that one of the people they could be talking with is an AI, that there's a level of distrust. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Yeah, not gamers, sorry. People like doing cooperative games in a lab. So like sort of behavioral economics studies, ultimatum game or some version of kind of a prisoner's dilemma scenario. So as far as I'm aware, this hasn't been published yet, but the people working on the experiment told me about it. It's a very well-known group of researchers on human AI interactions. I won't say who they are, just in case the final results of the paper change in some way. But I mean, if you want to know, they published the most cited paper on human kind of AI and moral psychology, and attracted a lot of media attention. It was the largest experiment run in history. Okay, so what one of them told me is that they were running experiments where people were asked to engage in these cooperative games in a lab where they had to bargain with somebody over a particular output. And they were told that there's a chance that the other person was using, so they were interacting in a purely chat-based interface. So they weren't looking at each other, they weren't talking to each other, it was just text-based interactions. And they were told that the other person might be using GPT to assist them when answering the questions. And so they found that, number one, this made them less trusting of the other side, and more that they needed a higher price, basically, to bargain or compromise with the other side. And number two, that if they gave people the option of paying to have a video call with the person where they could see them face to face or eye to eye, that people were willing to pay a fee that would cut into their overall gain from the game to see the person face to face, to confirm that they were interacting with a real person as opposed to somebody interacting with GPT assistants. So, I mean, that was a while ago that they told me that. They were still working on variations of the experiment kind of controls. So, take everything I say here with a grain of salt. Maybe it won't pan out as a result. And even if they did find this in this particular study, it would just be one study. But that's what I was told about it.
Thank you.
One thing I considered sometimes the system of AI. And I used the example in a previous session of, we have dams that are all controlled by a single AI that has the same training data, and the same training data that controls all this for robots, if I use an example here. I think a little bit about this digital duplication as a way to bring more risk controls to isolate. So if I may, if I need to run 4 dams, instead of training an omnipotent AI on an entire system of data, right? Training that AI on 4 different engineers who have background experience in the field to try to reduce the risk of compartmentalizing the risk of one omnipotent AI versus digital duplicates of individual people. So I'm curious if you've heard any of that or researched any of that area.
So I couldn't hear exactly what you said. So what was the example you were using? To control what?
So I have 4 dams and
dams.
Yeah.
Or of a river.
Yep, dams in a river.
Okay,
Yep.
Sorry.
Yeah. They could all be trained by the same database, and they could all be very identical AI, more or less, systems. I see digital duplication as an opportunity where if I have, instead of 4, robot 1, 2, and 3, 4, I have personas 1, 2, and 3, and 4 of 4 different people that have different training, I guess maybe training data based on the digital duplication process, if I understand correctly. Do you see that as a viable way to reduce risk, having individual personas through this, more human, more isolated AI, as opposed to system AIs that control certain infrastructure or other things?
Yeah, so I mean, like whether it creates less risk or it's a viable strategy for creating less risk is something that is above my sort of pay grade or level of understanding. Like the only thing I would say is that so one of the examples I gave in the paper was of this kind of medical decision-making assistance AI. So as I say, there's a large kind of well-funded project from the Templeton Foundation being run by Walter Sennett Armstrong and Jana Borg, and they've published several papers on this. That's essentially what they're trying to do, is that instead of creating like a generic AI decision-making bot, they obviously have a background model which has been trained on lots of data, but then they fine-tune it on a specific clinician to sort of replicate their specific clinical judgment. And they think that is a better way of assisting medical decision making than trying to create this sort of generic AI bot. I think part of that is I think part of it is risk mitigation, but I also think part of it is trust over the technology in some way, that the individual physician is more likely to trust the technology if they think it's been trained on them, as opposed to or a colleague of theirs or something like that, than thousands of others. And maybe that's just a quirk in human psychology, but that seems to be one of the rationales behind it.
Thank you.
Other questions? Yes.
I was going to ask about, so what are the benefits? You said was continuation and preservation, specifically in the case of music of ABBA, and in the case of the Beatles' last song being finished by AI, but obviously with some of the numbers like not there, like where does that go into legalities of like the ongoing consent, like an informed consent, like with the estates on their behalf or whoever controls the estate on their behalf?
Yeah, so I think that is that's an important problem. So I'm just trying to pull up the thing what we say in the paper on after people die. Yeah, so what we say is that sort of 3 things. Number one, we think that as a general rule of thumb, like if you're going to create a duplicate of a deceased person, you should ordinarily be getting that person's consent beforehand, right? So if it's possible to get their consent, you should be getting their consent prior to their death. If it's not possible to get their consent, then I think it might be worth sort of distinguishing between like how recently deceased they were, and that might make a difference. So, for example, as I gave the example of Tyler Cowen creating or as a bit of a fun entertainment exercise, creating this chatbot version of Jonathan Swift, the Irish author. Jonathan Swift died in 17 something. I can't remember exactly when he died. It seems to be relatively harmless for somebody to create a chatbot version of Swift, given sort of how far in the past he died. Somebody creating a chatbot version of somebody who's much more recently deceased, I think poses greater ethical risks, because I think we do have some interest in what happens to us after we die. There is a way of harming people posthumously. That's a somewhat controversial ethical idea, but a lot of people accept it. So I get how recently somebody died would make a difference to how permissible it would be. I don't know the John Lennon example. Let's say I'm not sure what to say about that. But one analogy you could draw here is with like copyright rules and law. That copyright rules typically allow people to control their output 70 years after their death, but you're not allowed to sort of continue thereafter. Now, I don't know if 70 years is the right time period, but something equivalent to that, I think, would be appropriate in the world of duplicates. So if you don't have somebody's informed consent to the creation of the duplicate, this sort of some posthumous period, or cooling off period that would reduce the risks associated with, or harms associated with creating the duplicate, would be appropriate. Now, that said, there may be some like particularly incendiary examples of chatbots that even 400 years after they died, you shouldn't try and create them. I mean, like, for example, I'll try and choose an illustration that's less likely to provoke people, but like I don't know if I'd be entirely happy if somebody tried to create like a chatbot version of Jesus or something like this. That would seem to be insensitive on many levels.
If I can pick up on that too, John, because I had a similar question about the informed consent condition in your minimally permissible criterion. I'm wondering, like, take art, for instance. We had an event on art appropriation last night, so this is kind of the forefront here. Suppose I wanted to paint a picture of, Barack Obama or something. Presumably, I don't need his consent to do that, right? To create this kind of artwork. I'm wondering whether or not, if I want to create a digital duplicate as a work of art, suppose I open up an art gallery and in there is all these digital duplicates. Would I need informed consent in that case if it's a kind of artwork? There seems to be a lot of latitude in allowing artists to do these sorts of things. So I'm wondering whether or not your criterion would, sort of rub up against some issues when it comes to art.
Yeah, so I mean, like, one of the things that we say in the paper is that the permissibility principle that we have is, as I say, minimally viable, is trying to be maximally agreeable, identifying one set of sufficient conditions for permissibility. It might be possible to make a case for legitimate exceptions in the case of some people. So again, maybe there's like a public interest exception that allows you to create a duplicate of a well-known person or public figure for some purpose. And again, that sort of chimes in with other areas of law where like public interest figures have less protections, let's say in the area of defamation law or something like this, right? That's certainly true in the US. So that could be a relevant consideration here. The example that we use in the paper, which isn't exactly yours or Barack Obama illustration, is that, if I wanted to paint a picture of my boss at work and pin it to the back of my bedroom door and throw darts at it as a way of venting my frustration, there's nothing to prevent me from doing that right now, okay? So you might say, well, like, why shouldn't I be able to create a digital duplicate of my boss for the same purpose? I torture it in my spare time. This is, by the way, that's I guess a plot of an episode of Black Mirror, but I won't get into that. One reason why you might differentiate between the two of them is that I think that it's it's relatively easy to keep the picture painted on the back of the door as something that is purely private and playful. Whether you can keep a digital duplicate purely private and playful is more challenging. And this is one of the main problems with the technology is the ease of copyability and the phenomenon of kind of surveillance and third-party oversight of these technologies. So that's one reason for mitigating between them. I also think there is probably something qualitatively different about throwing darts at an image of a person and like try to, maybe functionally recreate somebody's identity in a digital form and then torturing them in some way or harming them in some way. At a minimum, I would say that creating the digital duplicate version requires collecting more personal data about the duplicated person. And I think that has the potential to violate more of their sort of privacy and data rights. So that would be a kind of qualitative difference between those two things as well.
Great. Any other questions? We're about out of time, but yeah, last one.
You mentioned there was another ethical condition to your minimal requirements, and you said that you weren't going to get into it at the moment, but I was curious what that actually was, what you considered to be sort of important enough to add.
So yeah, no, I didn't include it here because it's like slightly. I just think like maybe it would take too long to explain in the initial presentation, but so there's like a fifth condition that we add in the paper, which is that you could so take the other four conditions, informed consent, minimal value, transparency, risk mitigation, plus there is no reason to think that this is a context in which real and authentic presence is required. Okay, so the idea here is that maybe it's not permissible to create a duplicate of a person in certain contexts because there is an ethical demand for a real person to be present. And so I don't know. You could think of maybe slightly innocuous versions of this and maybe more serious versions of it, but like, if I sent a digital duplicate version of myself, like a robotic double of myself, to attend the birth of my first child, maybe that would be deemed like sort of insensitive and inappropriate because my real authentic presence is required or something like this, sending a digital duplicate to vote on your behalf or something would be deemed problematic. So there could be certain contexts in which the real person needs to be present for a variety of reasons, and those should also be sort of respected when it comes to the ethical deployment of the technology. So that was the idea there.
Great. Well, thanks so much, John. This was really interesting. So we appreciate it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks.
Thanks everyone for coming. John, if you want me to send you the recording, just shoot me an email. I'll send it your way. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Thanks.
All right. Thanks again.
All right. Okay. Good afternoon. Good evening. Bye.